Welcome to 10 Minutes On, a podcast from the Joint Public Issues team. My name's Sienna, and I'm a Joint Public Issues team intern. Joining me today is Jennifer Philpot-Nissen from the World Council of Churches. Jennifer is the WCC's Programme Executive on Human Rights and Disarmament. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here today. We're just going to jump straight in. You've worked on disarmament and arms control for a while now. Why is this an issue that you care about as a Christian?
Well, hello, Sienna, and thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I have a background in human rights rather than disarmament, and I started my career in the UN working largely on issues of child rights. And this work led me to engage on issues of child soldiers, and I could soon see the strong nexus between the flow and availability of lightweight weapons, which children can carry, and the resulting forced or coerced involvement of children in war and armed conflict. And northern Uganda, for example, Sierra Leone in the late 90s, there was the widespread use of children as young as 10 being kidnapped and forced to fight or coercively recruited with promises of food and from a lack of other viable options in their lives. And then later on, when I joined the World Council of Churches in 2017, I became involved in the work of churches to advocate for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons and for a preemptive global ban on the development and use of autonomous weapons. And it was a really exciting time because that year the UN adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and the campaign, which the World Council of Churches had been an active part of, then went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize that year for its role in bringing the treaty into being. But of all the issues I've worked on, I think at the heart, we're talking about injustice and sin, human suffering, and it's always the most vulnerable and marginalized who are worst affected. So as a Christian, I feel that those of us who are privileged to have a voice, we really need to be speaking out for those who do not.
Thank you. Having grown up, so I grew up in Uganda, and so very much was aware of the really negative impact of arms on children in particular, and it's really interesting to hear you reference that. And clearly, as Christians, there's a real mandate to look after the poor and the marginalized. And this is, as you say, an issue that particularly impacts those people. So are there any key theologians, books, or Bible passages that have informed your opinions on this issue? You've just said that you think it actually, as Christians, we are called to care about this.
Well, I think the obvious one with disarmament is from Isaiah, where it says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And that one is often quoted for those who are working in disarmament from a Christian perspective. But I think rather than theologians or books, it's really been the experience of talking directly to people who've been affected by weapons in their lives that's most formed my opinions. And these, of course, include the Acholi people of northern Uganda, whom I met in 2001 whilst on a UN visit to villages such as Gulu, Kitgum, Para. And some of these had visible scars from the attacks they had suffered, but all of them were carrying much deeper psychological scars from the trauma of so many years of conflict. And around the same time in my career, people I met in a small town called Tecum in Guatemala, which is on the border with Mexico, which even the police told us this town based its entire existence and economy on the trafficking of people, of drugs and weapons, both north into Mexico and the US and south from those countries. So as you can imagine, the levels of violence were extremely high. Entire families caught up in drug dealing, drug using, prostitution and pimping, and guns were an everyday part of their lives.
So you've had lots of experiences working in this for a long time and have a background, as you've said, in human rights. For those of us who are newer to thinking about arms control, what is the overlap between arms control and the theology?
Well, I think that all these weapons and our very false belief in their necessity or their deterrent effect stem from a place of fear, insecurity, or hatred of others. People have written long PhD theses about just war theory and whether it's still valid and how it's changing. But I think if we look to the New Testament, we see more Jesus is really, he talks about peace rather than war. So that's certainly what I follow.
I think there's probably, as you say, so much that people could go away and read and think about. But I certainly, reading through the Gospels, reading through Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, you can see that there's a very high, even if you don't completely subscribe to disarmament or think that there can maybe be just wars, there's clearly an extremely high bar for violence. And peace is what we should all be working towards, and that's very clear. From your work with the World Council of Churches, what would you say the role of the church is in pushing forward the disarmament agenda?
Well, with the WCC and its member churches, which are many, we estimate we represent more than 500 million Christians. The member churches have spoken out against nuclear weapons right from the time they were first used. And now if I turn to killer robots, autonomous weapon systems, we created a guide for churches. It's available on our website, a sort of an introduction as to what killer robots are. And we feel that they are something that God would definitely not welcome or encourage. We use some theologies on that. And the guide is available in several languages. But at the national level, our church partners in Nigeria then organised several events to raise awareness with religious leaders and youth activists, who in turn then called upon their own government to become active in the campaign to call for a global preemptive ban on fully autonomous weapons. And the Nigerian government heeded this call and has indeed for the last couple of years been one of the vocal proponents for such a regulatory framework. So we would really call on churches in the UK to also put pressure on the government. The new government, hopefully at a time when the new government is listening and receptive to what civil society is telling it, to really join the call for a global regulatory framework.
That's so encouraging to hear of stories like the story of churches in Nigeria, and to hear that there is potential. Well, there are churches who are having an impact on this issue at a national level. What unique contribution do you think the faith or Christian voice makes in this area of human rights campaigning, and where and how is it being heard?
So I think at this point I should mention the work of the interfaith groups in this respect. For our work with both nuclear disarmament and with killer robots, we regularly work with established interfaith groups, which includes Muslims, Baha'i, Soka Gakkai, the Sikhs and others, as well as different Christian denominations and of course our Catholic brothers and sisters, to raise our collective voice against the threats that these weapons pose, and to affirm that our different faith perspectives all teach us a profound respect for human life and a duty to work for the good of others. And I believe that working together like this demonstrates a strong and unified voice standing together and rejecting any claims that the further development of weapons are in anyone's interests.
Well, thank you for all of the work that you and the team at the World Council of Churches are doing on this really important issue. And thank you for being on the podcast with us today. If people want to engage with what the World Council of Churches is doing on arms control or just generally, you can go to oikumene.org, and that's OIKOUMENE.org, and you'll be able to find resources, updates, and World Council of Churches news.
That's it for this episode of the 10 Minutes On podcast focused on the future of arms. If you'd like to find out more about advances in warfare, head to jpit.uk/FOA for briefings, blogs, videos, ways to take action, and more podcast episodes. That's jpit.uk/FOA. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do share it around. Thanks for listening.